But the reason we're here is to try to integrate across disciplines in speaking about cultures, child rearing, human development, well-being, and ill-being, but trying to move us towards a more positive, I guess, or healthful-oriented approach to these matters, to culture and child rearing. So tomorrow we're going to be talking about applied issues. We have a panel all morning, but now we want to focus on the talks that we've heard, and you want to take over now, Michelle, or you want me to keep talking?
Yeah, we just want to get you guys talking to each other. Any questions you have for each other about your talks. So we're going to get more into the science today and then more into the applied and clinical issues tomorrow. So should we go one by one, or should we let people just go for it, free for all? I'll pass around the microphone, and any questions you have for each other about your work that you
Or
presented.
last thought, you didn't
Final
say
thoughts.
that maybe something later spurred an additional thought you had about your own presentation. Oh, go ahead. All right.
For the last speaker, there is a book for therapy with children called Theraplay by Ann Jernberg. I don't know if you ever heard of that. You mentioned at one point the ability to limit self-awareness as associated with dissociation. Did I get that correctly? Limit self-awareness? Yes. I thought I heard you say that.
Limit self-awareness?
Yes.
Did I say that?
Okay, let's erase that one. Maybe you didn't say that. I don't know. As associated with dissociation?
Oh, that self-reflection is usually not very developed when there's dissociation present. And I quoted that Bromberg quote that said
Yes.
that the inability to self-reflect is the hallmark of dissociation.
Okay, yeah.
I think that's
It was inability. I thought it was
inability.
ability. Okay.
Yeah.
Never mind.
Yeah.
That answers what the question would have been.
Okay. This is a question that actually is directed to anybody that spoke that would like to answer it, but I was thinking a lot, and this came up during several talks or question and answer, and Carlin's not here, but she was one that actually looked at the mediating, or in fact, not mediating effect of infant genotype in terms of serotonin promoter region in the long-short alleles. But I want to take it back to this question of, a lot of times I think our talks, and I know mine certainly did this, approach the infant as though they're somewhat tabula rasa, or that infants are unformed until they have maternal behavioral care or allo care or paternal care or whatever. And I was just wondering, because you brought up how some infants are actually self-directing and resilient, or children, and so I was thinking, how do you guys think we should be researching things about infant or child agency or their own actions to compensate for deficits in the care that they're receiving? And because this is something that we think about in primate research, and we find that infants are actually exerting substantial efforts in compensating for deficits in maternal care. And I was just kind of wondering what your thoughts are on that.
I do have a thought on that. Is this working yet?
Hold it close to your mouth.
Okay. One of the things that I've been struck listening to all of this, and it's quite understandable, is there's an awful lot of emphasis on the mother, the poor mother. I mean, anything goes wrong, it's the mother's fault, right? And I'm just thinking now, do we solve that problem by correcting mothers somehow? Or is that really a problem of looking at what do babies really need? And maybe they need more than mothers, Maybe they need siblings around. Maybe they need other women around. My understanding is in a hunter-gatherer culture, you can't abuse a baby. You can't neglect a baby. You can't, because somebody else will pick up the baby. We're never going to solve these problems at the individual level. We can work on them. We need to work at the individual level. This is therapy. This is all the early intervention. That's important. But our automatic way in our culture is to think of these as individual problems rather than to think of them as systemic social problems. Babies need to be raised not in that mother-infant dyad. That's not natural. They need to be raised in this setting that includes the whole band. Well, how do you solve that problem within the context of our culture? Maybe I'm anticipating things that will be talked about tomorrow, but I do think that if we really want to solve the problem socially, we're not going to solve it through therapy. Not that we shouldn't do therapy. The people who are hurt need help. The babies who don't have a good mother need some kind of help with that, because in our culture, that baby is so dependent on the mother. But somehow, if we really want to solve the problem, if we really want to create a human environment for our children, we need to solve these structurally so that babies are being raised by a number of people. Anyway, that's just a
And that is something we want to focus on tomorrow in particular, but it's a really important issue. But it links, actually, there's a link to what Katie just said in terms of Alan Sroufe, one of the foremost researchers in attachment theory, at least empirical. And he has said to me that a child is resilient if they got 6 months, just 6 months of good care somehow in those early years. That's what they've found over their longitudinal studies. And it reminds me of Bruce Perry's book, The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog. And he talks about this resilient child. The child was raised in a cage by the grandfather. But before the grandfather took over the care, he had 6 months with his grandmother, raising him very sensitively. Then he ended up, I don't know how many years in this cage, but he was later able to recover remarkably. So the clinicians probably have many more stories. But anyway, I see that there is this communal care child rearing that we really need to address, and I think we'll focus more on the specific application tomorrow, but it's related, yes.
And what you just said, is it the 0 to 6 months, or does it need to be the first 6 months, or any 6 months during the 3 years?
I think it's any 6 months in the first 2 years, but I don't know if he actually gave me the exact amount, but that seems to be, the right brain is developing rapidly in the first 2 years, so that's...
Right, I don't think we actually quite know, right? What 6 months is it? Right?
Yes, we don't know, no.
But certainly, you see that clinically, right? If you have that one secure attachment, the outcome is often very, very different. Yeah. It's a key question really to ask during any assessment, right? Have you ever felt safe with anyone, and see what you get there.
So just to follow up on the point just made about where we should focus for intervention. I won't go into too much because I know we're going to focus on this tomorrow. But I agree entirely that if we simply focus on mothers, we're going to be struggling to make any kind of widespread improvement. And I think it's not the parenting per se that's the problem, it's the whole context in which parenting is occurring. Even in the rodents, we can see the mother's behavior is driven by the quality of their environmental experiences at the time of when they're giving care to their offspring or their lifetime of experience. And if we don't intervene at the level of the greater environment, about the stressors, about the way in which individuals are interacting with the society, any improvement in the short term will not last because we haven't changed the environment. So I think that's important. But maybe to get back to, or do you want to follow up on that?
Just the same.
Okay.
Just more. No, just to follow up, certainly in terms of what happens in the communities, the kids are, moving about and moving to a number of different caregivers. So the idea of the mother-infant sort of focus is really, and Western sort of centric, but so that, and just what I mentioned the other day in terms of the infants are always facing out, and part of that reasoning of putting the kids out all the time is to have this multiple others interacting on a regular basis. But once the kids crawl, they're just crawling, in a number of different people's laps, and they're just moving around, so that you have a number of different others that are contributing on a regular basis.
That's all right. And I just wanted to follow up on Katie's point about offspring and their role in this whole dynamic. And certainly even with the rodents, we see this much more difficult when you've got 16 to 20 babies. But if you do cross-fostering, there are different strains of mice and rats, and they differ in their maternal care, and you think, well, that's driving all of these developmental effects in the offspring. Now, if you do cross-fostering, you find that the offspring are very good at soliciting whatever kind of care they're accustomed to. So even if they're given to a high care mother, she'll reduce her care when she's with these offspring that are accustomed to less care. So it's an interesting interplay between the offspring and the mothers and trying to find that kind of optimal interaction. And in terms of compensation, what we're seeing in the animal studies is that the offspring certainly do compensate, and usually they compensate by enhanced play in later life. And so if you're prevented from both maternal care and later life play with siblings, this can be very problematic and drive some of the long-term disturbances in behavior.
Reminds me of Huck Finn and Tom Sawyer. Huck Finn spent a lot of time playing, right? Didn't have a lot of parenting. And we used to have that available, right? But we've kind of locked down kids now and don't let them play.
I'd just like to ask the question about the focus on babies. I mean, that many of the talks focused on babies, and I, living in the groups that I do, I mean that it's across the lifespan, and so that certainly in terms of brain development, I mean, and such, in terms of the sensitivity, in terms of brain development with infancy, but I just like in terms of, to get some idea in terms of a greater rationale in terms of why the focus, even the pattern that you listed in terms of focus most completely on infancy, and so that there's nothing about, what happens later in life in terms of being significant. And I just like to ask the rest of the group about the rest of childhood.
And for example, the co-sleeping, you want to just say that?
Yeah, no, one thing that I asked about the model in terms of humanity, what really distinguishes humans versus our great apes is co-sleeping past weaning, and that was not on your list. And so in terms of what gets on the list and what doesn't,
It was your list. I got it from you.
well, we make them up as we go.
It was early experience focused, though, yeah.
All right. I have to have something to say here, but as regards Katie's comment, and actually the dyad, who Peter was talking about the dyad, it's that tension. Let me start there. I had a little slide in mind saying that there's this interesting tension. I've had to argue to draw attention to the significance of the physiological regulatory effects that at least one individual, usually primarily the mother, gives the baby, is an important radical concept for Western science. I think the biggest enemy for babies and mothers has been indeed, in many cases, the science of parenting. And I say that because it isn't compatible with the typical reductionist model that can work so well in other domains. And what I mean by that, it's very hard for American scientists to really appreciate that if you want to know about how babies breathe, and how their immune system works, you can't look at the baby. You have to look at the baby in context, there's that word again, in context with its expectable environment. And there is no doubt about that, and it's not just to be cute. There is no environment to which that baby is adapted except to its mother's body. Now, that isn't a particularly politically easy thing to say. It isn't that the baby isn't adapted to other bodies too, but I think you do have to begin there because that's where the baby gets its nutrition. So obviously that's a pretty key factor here. But we've also learned, and now we've come to appreciate, the matrix within which the dyad operates and assumes its ultimate validity and functional efficiency. and that is by virtue of other individuals taking the baby as well. But I've always thought this is a difficult set of issues. One, that Western science is embedded with social values and ideologies, as is everything. And in our cultures, we've always wanted the little all-American, individualist, autonomy. And we begin to define babies in terms of who we want them to become rather than who they actually are. And we kind of miss these actual states, that they're very, very, very different. So the Western scientific model, and coupled with these ideologies that masquerade as science, I fight this every day. With my particular area, it's one of the more controversial ones, sleeping with your baby. And it is complex. The same phenomenon that could be life-saving can be lethal and kill a baby. So I understand the complexity. But where I think the value evolution lies is it's ultimately, like the baby itself, very, very honest. I mean, you define infants in terms of their biology first, see where it takes you, look at this context, look at the evolution and the context within which we evolved. I think that's very powerful. It's a very powerful beginning point. It's not the end point, and this is where some of us get into trouble. By virtue of making your case strongly, you can't talk about everything, and that's why in my case, I'm always limited. I'm not about to talk about alloparenting too much when I'm trying to convince physicians that the mother-infant diet as a unit is the unit of analysis, as I was saying yesterday. So I got to kind of drop that, and I could give people the misimpression that, oh my gosh, there's McKenna again talking about mothers and babies, you know? But you have to take one thing at a time. But for what it's worth, and I'd just like to get back to Katie's point about how babies are very honest. They know what they feel. They're not trying to do anything to anyone. They're very close to their genes, as I was trying to suggest yesterday, just as an observation. And they negotiate their way around, so to speak. And they come into the life and they have a job to do. And their job to do is to rope that caregiver in as fast and as efficiently as they can. And parents are designed to respond to those particular cues and signals, obviously. And so there you are, that dance that you're speaking of, you know, Jean, is really true. So anyway, for what it's worth, there's a few thoughts.
And I'm gonna follow up on Barry's comment as to why we don't spend more time studying other time points during development, and steal Jim's comment, which is, you know, one thing at a time. and I know that, I mean, I kind of almost wonder if I think it's particularly challenging to study juveniles among at least wild living primates, because they're really hard to tell apart and actually do individual identification to follow the trajectory of one individual. It's easy to study mothers and infants because by the time they're mothers, they've accumulated a number of scars and missing fingers and patches of hair and things like that. You can identify them, and you know which infant is theirs most of the time because it's the one that goes running back to them whenever there's a disturbance. But juveniles are same body size, they look the same, they haven't gotten into as many scrappy fights. And I think, at least with my research, there's limited, amount of staff hours of effort, right? And I think this is actually a huge missing element, at least in the non-human primate research, in terms of understanding those really critically important transition periods, right? So as a yearling rhesus macaque, your mom has likely had your younger sibling, and all of a sudden you're displaced from that primary social bond that you've had. And that's a period of potential very traumatic separation from your mother. And I think we know very, very little about that socio-emotionally. And I think you're right, it's an absolutely critical time of research, and I think there's more in the human literature, but I don't think it's being addressed, at least by evolutionary perspectives, as much as it could be.
I can maybe also follow up on the point that Barry just made, or the question that Barry just raised about. My focus has been primarily on children age 4 to about 17, not on infants. And what I am struck by when I observe kids in this school where there's 150 kids from age 4 to about 17 or 18 is how much physical proximity there is. There are they sit close, they sit on one another's lap. This is not sexual, this is not, the little kids seek out the teenagers' laps. They're sitting out, teenagers are doing teenage things with other teenagers, and there's a little kid on each of their laps. And the teenagers are reading to kids. They love the kids, and the kids love them. And where else in the world are we seeing this now? In the 1950s, when I was 13 years old, I could babysit. What mother would hire a 13-year-old boy to babysit today? How do you get experience, interact? Oh, there's somebody who said she would. You see, there were studies done years ago that were interesting to me of cross-age interactions within the school system. And there was one study, it was done, if I remember right, in the 1970s, in which what was found was that this was a tutoring situation, and what was found was that before the tutoring situation could even work, these were teenagers with young kids, there had to be developed an emotional bond. And the young kids didn't want to learn from the teenagers right off about the lessons. They wanted to sit on their laps, they wanted to hug. What school would allow that now? This is sexual, abuse. This would get you suspended. We have moved our great fear of, in some ways justifiable about sexual abuse has moved us increasingly towards a society of separateness, of not recognizing that it's not just infants that will crave close contact. Kids of all ages do.
And it hasn't touched the problem of sexual abuse, right?
And it hasn't touched it, it's made it worse, right?
I'm not sure about that, but
Yeah.
it hasn't touched it.
I don't know.
Along those lines, it's the body. It's the proximity of bodies and being a body. Parallel to the problem of co-sleeping in America is the fundamental problem of sleeping. Americans are underslept, and that's also correlated with obesity. And obesity is another problem, and we're underwalked in America. And we have a system, for example, marketing to kids in 1983 was $100 million. 25 years later, it was $170 billion. It went up 170 times. We have a massive increase in the propagandization of everyday life of signs of materialism. But the materialism is a system that instills mental desires. Materialism is a mentalism. Its job is to disconnect you from your real body and your real feelings and emotions and to install, its desires in you. And so it seems to me there's a whole problem of the disconnect in America in ways in which, paradoxically, we might need to become more materialistic in the sense of more appreciative of the sensuous body and the sensuous body's needs as a way to combat that system.
My concern is that we are raising children to be quite detached from their bodies, detached from relationships, in part because of this hands-off of babies, letting them cry, treating them as machines almost. And then in school, they are told to not feel their feelings or exercise their bodies again, and focused on this semantic knowledge, which trains the left brain up and teaches them, how the IQ, the Flynn effect, in the 20th century in the United States, IQ scores went up. And when Flynn looked at the data himself, he says what's changed is not really basic arithmetic or things like that. It's the ability to answer hypothetical questions. So it's scientific thinking, which is all good stuff, except not if you're neglecting the body and the heart and the relationships. So it seems to me we've grown accustomed, our baselines have shifted, and we've grown accustomed to having sort of shallow relationships and more self-centeredness. We think it's normal to be self-interested. And so I think it's this whole host of factors that have just been sliding us towards that. And again, as I said yesterday, destroying our habitat if we don't do something to turn ourselves around. And so we have these more and more extreme maladapted, well, I would call them, instead of a phenotype, maladapted people who are just trying to survive, since we have our nature is, organisms want to adapt to their environment just to live. Life wants to live. And we've slid in that direction. And I want us, though, to focus on optimizing our development. We've got all these problems to face, and we need our best selves and our best minds for it. So we have to shift, do some major cultural shifting, make these messages, which we can talk about tomorrow, sticky, so they become a virus of understanding what kids need and what we need. We need affection too, and change the culture, because cultures can shift quickly if you can make it a sticky message that's emotional, that means something. And we can talk about that tomorrow, though. I'll stop. I'll get off my soapbox.
Peter, I was wondering if I could just get back to your talk for a second. You talked about this incredible decrease of play and increase in psychopathology. Do you have any information about that across cultures? Was this referring more to North America, or is this?
Yeah, these studies were all done in North America. The studies of looking at, I don't even know if the standardized tests that can be used to assess the increase in psychopathology have been given in other countries. But the same thing is happening in other countries, there's no question. I was interviewed a few weeks ago by somebody from public television in South Korea. South Korea, of course, is suffering. Children are terribly suffering, you know. And their concern was the fact that 2- and 3-year-olds aren't playing, that they're in classes, they're being taught foreign languages, they're being taught calligraphy, they're doing all sorts of things, and a lot of the pressure comes from the mothers. And so it's not surprising that to the degree that we can tell, there's even more childhood psychopathology there. Japan has gone through terrible times. I mean, we were trying to model, for some period of time, we were trying to model the Japanese school system. While meanwhile, their children were suffering far more than ours, and now they're trying to loosen up their school system. They're recognizing that if they want creative people, they can't teach in that kind of way towards getting high test scores. So at the very same time, there's a woman at William and Mary who's recently published an article showing that over the past 30 years, this is another historical change. There's been a decline in creativity among school children in our country over the same period that there's been a decline in play. Who would think that there's an objective measure of creativity, but it is one of these things. I would be suspicious of it, except for the fact that this Torrance test of creativity actually is predictive, in that there's a long history of tests of it. The kids who score high on it, other things controlled, are far more likely to do really creative things in life as they become adults. So the test has some validity. This test over the past 25 to 30 years, there's been a continuous decline. IQ continues to increase, but IQ is not as predictive of future real-world achievement and accomplishment as the Torrance test of creativity is. Well, one of the points she makes, she's of Asian origin, one of the points she makes is, you know, we think we're trying to catch up to the Asians. They're trying to catch up to us. And they are beginning to really be concerned about creativity, and they're trying to figure out how to introduce more play and allow the kids to be creative. So, you know, there's kind of cultures moving in different directions.
And creativity probably relates to curiosity as well, right?
Creativity definitely relates to curiosity, and you know, and curiosity relates to all sorts of learning. I mean, you know, what we call learning in this country is getting a high score on a test, and that, of course, is not learning. That, of course, is not, and it's learning is understanding. Learning is incorporating something into your being so that it really affects the way you think, the way you behave, the way you interact with others. The kinds of behaviors that go into getting high test scoring don't do that. That's just not learning.
Actually, I see this in our medical students, just this decrease in curiosity, just this complete lack of curiosity. It's frightening. Yeah.
There's an interesting movie called The War on Kids, and it shows, it has several segments, but one of them is the zero tolerance policies in many schools and how adults have just lost, I mean, in my view, lost their imaginations, and they give a detention to a child who holds up a chicken McNugget as a as a gun or something, and a girl who had Advil was carrying drugs, and these people get suspended. Texas is particularly bad for almost felonizing just normal child behavior. So these kids have criminal records when they leave high school or before if they leave. Anyway, we've gotten crazy. I mean, part of it's a lack of imagination, a lack of understanding relationships and the flexibility. So that's part of what's lost when we lose the right brain ability to be present in the moment, to feel, empathize with others. On and on.
I know Kevin Soling, who's the person who created the War on Kids film, and I would recommend it. A lot of people look at it and they kind of dismiss it. These are extreme cases, but what he does is very effective in this film. He leads you. He has a principal of a school lead him through this school, and then he has the head of a prison, a high-security prison, lead him through the prison. After the two, you would rather be in the prison. The prisoners have more freedom. The prisoners have more, they can go into the library whenever they want. They can actually use the library. The kids can't. They have the protections that we guarantee to adults. So there's certain things you can't do to them. Kids in our schools don't have the same protections. They don't have the rights to due process. Pretty much anything can be done to them. You get accused of doing something wrong, and you don't really have a recourse. And that's one of the most incredible features of Sudbury schools, is that there's nobody who can accuse you of anything except through a judicial system and a trial by your peers, and there's due process. That's one of the major beliefs in our society, and yet we're raising kids in a setting in which that does not apply to them.
General comment about that. I've had to do a lot of thinking in and around the science that I do. And I've realized that the science, in my case, looking at these interactions and physiological differences between babies sleeping with their mothers and not, that's really quite irrelevant to the kind of conversation that emerges. It seems that the constituencies that make important decisions about children outside the home have no interest in the science. They have an interest in maintaining their own control, and it's all about who controls what is talked about. And in this case, what is not talked about is how to make, just to give you an example, a safe bed-sharing, co-sleeping environment. What is talked about is all the babies that die because it's not done safely, and it's so easy then to conclude that no one can do it. And what I've been so frustrated with is that our own citizens are so easy with relocating the focus of control for decision making, to the extent that many of our parents don't even know they have the right to make that decision for themselves, where their children will sleep. There are thousands of parents in our country that buy cribs with no intention of using them, but they're fearful that a child protective service agent will come and take their baby away. When that is true, that means we've already lost some civil political liberties. It's already gone. And I've been shocked at, for a democratic society, how little perceptions people have of their own liberties. And somehow we've managed to, in this case, we've medicalized, in a sense, features of our lives that are not medical issues. Where a parent decides to have their baby generally reflects how they care to nurture them, communicate with them, share their love with them. And parents are afraid to tell anybody where their babies are. They whisper, and of course, when they're in a co-sleeping friendly environment, they say, oh, I sleep with my baby. They're afraid to actually discuss where their baby is. And so I guess our issues are economic and political, isn't it always? I mean, in some ways. Economic and all these things are tied together. And Jean, I love listening to you, but I get so frustrated because it seems hopeless after I hear you talk, you know, because there has to be a beginning point, you know, a point where let's make the observations, and Jean, I'm not saying you have to come up with the solutions, but all together sometimes it's all about defining the problems, and come on, let's get in there, do whatever, however small, and solve one local problem and not be afraid to talk about it. And to assert that, you know, this is a democracy here. And if we want to change things just like Rachel Carson did, and just like in the 60s, you know, when the hippies were all talking about bringing out buckets to recycle, you know, goods, and we all thought, oh, that's so ridiculous. You know, what will they think of next? And then all of us now have green and blue or whatever your, you know, garbage pail is. We really do this. So, I mean, on one hand, it does get feeling kind of hopeless, but it's really true. Things can be changed here. This is culture. If you change the ideologies and the values that underlie some of these issues, there are alternatives. Well, like my thoughts are, Peter, how many people can go to that school? Is that for the rich?
The school operates on a budget that is less than half per pupil of the local public schools. So this is not expensive education. If we adopted this form of education, we would save a lot of taxpayer money. This is not expensive education. It's not for the rich. It's for anybody who can, nor is it for the selected students in any way. Anybody can go there, and a lot of the students who go there are kids who've more or less been failing in the public school, and then they just do great once they're there. So a lot of the kids go there who have been diagnosed as ADHD. They go off their Ritalin and they do fine. They get in trouble with the judicial system and their peers punish them, but they come around, you know, they come around. So it's not for the rich. This is a school that, as far as I can tell, works for anybody, and it works. People often say, now the experiment has not really been done. Not a lot of poor minority people are interested in sending their child to such a school. And so we don't have a lot of experience there. And so people say, well, a lot of people think the big problem with schools, everybody focuses on the gap between the poor and the minorities and the kids from middle-class homes and test scores and so on and so forth. And so people focus on that problem, but it is very clear that our standard school system hasn't solved that gap problem. And to me, it's pretty obvious why. It also is pretty obvious to me from my experiences that a school like Sudbury can easily solve that gap problem. Why? Because what the school provides is essentially an extended family. The staff are like rich uncles and aunts, not rich in the sense of a lot of money, but rich in that a lot of them have been to college and they know how to do those kinds of things. And if you do this in a way that the kids are, you know, mixed with kids from a variety of backgrounds, you now become friends with somebody whose mom is a doctor, you know, or you become, you now are in an environment where a lot of kids are reading, and so you want to read. So, you know, I'm absolutely convinced that this school is dismissed by most educators because they believe it's this school that would only work for certain selected kids, but they refuse to look at the evidence that suggests that's not the case. Yes.
I just wanted to respond. I think what Dr. McKenna was saying is that, is it affordable for low-income families? The answer is no. Parents do need to come up with tuition to send their kids there. So will it work for lower-income families? Probably, but there is no access because you do need to, as a parent, come up with that money to send your child there.
Yeah, that's true. And so you would need to be able to have some way of having state support for such a school. And at present, there cannot be state support for such a school because the state won't support it. And that's one reason why. I mean, there are some of the schools have sliding scales, and some of the schools have ways of doing it. And a lot of the kids come from families who are certainly not economically really well, but they're not in real poverty either.
But it could be a charter school.
It can't be a charter school.
It could be, I mean, you could use that model for a charter school.
In theory, you could, but you cannot in any current state because there's no state that would consider this to be a school in the sense that it could receive state funds. The requirements for receiving state funds are always a certain amount of testing, a certain amount of, you have to, in Massachusetts, for example, if you were to receive state funds, you've got to give the MCAS, and that absolutely undermines the philosophy of the school. So, and there are a lot of schools in other countries that are running illegally. Sudbury schools running illegally in Holland, in Germany, and these parents in some cases have been arrested for
Well,
sending them.
Finland doesn't test their children. They go to school and they don't test them till, I don't know, till the end of high school or something. So they have an amazing system that's working quite well. Some recent media on that.
I find it interesting that the school is in Massachusetts. We were talking at lunch, and you mentioned that there's more autonomy for the towns in Massachusetts to allow this to happen. It couldn't happen probably in Indiana. And maybe that's one of the last vestiges of New England democracy, Jim was
Well, it
referring
actually
to.
does happen in various ways in other states, too. There are about 25 Sudbury schools in the United States, in different states, and including one in Illinois. But they cannot receive state funds. They cannot receive federal funds. So that's why you've got to pay that $6,000 or $7,000 a year tuition. Now that's low tuition compared to any other private school I know, but it's still a tuition that excludes some people.
Can someone give her the wait.
Okay.
My husband is a teacher in the Cleveland City Schools, and in Cleveland there's a 3-tier system. We have vouchers, we have charter schools that are mostly for profit, and then we have the public schools. And Sudley, as a mother and as an academic, Sudley is really seductively appealing as a place to send my children. But I'm the product of public schools, and when I went to public school, it was public or you pay all your tuition yourself, private school. There was no in-between in the 1980s in Denver area that I'm aware of, to the point that I was having trouble in the public school. My mother looked into private schools and as a single mother could not afford it. And so we made the best we could, made do what we could. And it's those PTA moms that were hammering those teachers and really invested in those, and made the environment as wonderful as it was for me as an elementary school and middle school child, that improved the quality of my instruction to the point that I feel like it would be supremely ungrateful of me to turn around and not give that back to the community that my children are in. But my husband, he's teaching high school sciences, and he's got students coming in. The average reading level is probably around 5th grade for 9th graders. And the parents that have the financial and transportation ability to get their kids into the private schools, their kids are in the private schools. If they've got the transportation ability but not the financial ability, they're in the charter schools. And he's got what's left. The parents that have no transportation and no financial ability. Most of his kids are coming from the projects. And I mean, we're doing well this year that we haven't had any students seriously injured in their community. I'm recognizing a lot of the adolescent fallout of these earlier developmental issues, the maladaptive attachment styles and such that Dr. Valentino was talking about. These are the students that he's teaching. They're coming from these households. And I just really doubt that children that are coming from these households where they're being abused and neglected, and then taking them from that, even at 4 years old, and giving them the advantage of the school that you're talking about, I just don't think that they have the psychological tools to, if they're not imaginative playing at 2, how are they going to be self-directed learners at 4, or at 6, or at 8? And so that's why I really feel like we need to address the earlier childhood issues intensively first before, I mean, I would love to see American education turn into what you're describing. I think that would be fantastic for a lot of children. But I just don't think that a large percentage of our population's children are ready for that. The Sudbury is very self-selected. It's people who know about it, can afford it, and get through the approval process when there's an opening. It's not a representative sample at all of the children that are out there. And so you're taking the cream of the crop in a lot of ways, is what I worry about. You're not getting the kids from the neglected WIC families kind of things.
I'd really like to disagree with that. My name is Melissa Bradford, and I'm from the Sudbury School that's in the Chicago area. And a lot of our students are the ones who have been so miserable in school. They've been labeled. They've been behavior disorders, everything. We get those students because they can't find any other place to go. I'll also say, from the financial standpoint, our school, and there's at least one other school that has done that, we have a flexible tuition plan. So families can propose any amount that they want to pay, and then they can come to our school. So it's definitely, we have definitely not a selective population. We have a lot of people who really struggle financially. And also in terms of being able to get into the school, the only requirement that we have is that you have to be willing to take responsibility for your behavior. But other than that, there's no screening whatsoever for any kids.
Well, you do have, the parents have to be with it enough to be seeking this out for their children.
Yes, the parent support is a big issue too, because we have the parents who are on board, and then we have the parents who are just like, just take my kid and please fix them. So we do have a lot of parents who actually undermine the philosophy of the school with their kids, and that can be difficult for the kid. But we definitely have a wide spectrum.
Well, I recognize that you have a wide spectrum, and I'm very respectful of the fact that you're taking them and doing the best you can with them. I'm saying that there are even the parents that are saying, here, take my kid, fix them. They're taking some proactive action to fix the situation for their child. There's a lot of parents that don't have that empowerment. And those are the parents that my husband's got the children of. We've got generational poverty. We've got generational teen parents where, grandma of the high school student is 45. So they don't have this ability to even realize that they can go for that. And then they're pushing all the kids to go to college. And my husband's students are more likely to have, the men in their life are more likely to have criminal records than to have even completed high school. And so they don't have the role models. They don't have these people that they can look at and say, I want to be like that person in their community. They only have, the basketball stars. And it's really rough trying to reach them and connect them, the kids, much less the parents. If you can get them to return a phone call half the time, it's like cause for going out for a nice dinner celebration. It's like, oh my God, they actually called me back.
Thank you, Ami. That's a point well given and well taken.
Well, I had one response to that. My wife teaches early elementary school art in South Bend school system, and she gets kids from a lot of troubled families. And last year she was teaching middle school, and a lot of troubled kids. There's one class that came in with 2 or 3 aides because they were so much trouble. And these kids in her class would do a behavior they did in another class, and the aides would try to discipline them, and she had to get the aides to back off and allow the behavior in the class, because in her art class, it was not disruptive. because they had more they could move around in the room more, and just the nature of what art was allowed them to engage in a way that they could not engage in the other classes. You know, and this is, I mean, it's not going to cure their problems, but some of these kids never even had art before school. And it just suggests to me that we ignore at our peril all of these sensuous qualities of the body, of putting feelings into form in art, of gym, of recess, that if we start with the body, and you know, the Montessori says follow the child, well, follow the body too. It's certainly a start. And yet our society, the educational equivalent of the materialism of consumption, where you just get branded and it's all mental desires, is the abstraction of test scores, replacing, they did away with writing in the schools because it got in the way of studying for the reading test.
Not learning.
Cursive, right?
Yeah, that's true.
I'd like, oh, is there a comment?
Well,
Yeah, go ahead.
Darcia, I was just going to comment on something she said about the charter schools. Here in Indiana, we have charter schools and vouchers and public schools and academies. It's all different levels of participation. And I have a child in a public school academy, and they like to say that they're highly motivated students. It's highly motivated parents that put their children in those schools. So you take those highly motivated parents out of all the other schools and concentrate them into one school. And it's that kind of fragmentation and fighting for resources. And, you know, so instead of, yeah, that's one school is doing fabulous in this area and at the detriment of all these others. And then it successfully pits us against other people instead of us working collectively to improve the entire system. So I thought she had a really good point at that.
Thanks. Yes, I was going to ask you a question, Kirsten, but yes, go ahead.
I just thought it was worth highlighting or reiterating, you know, kind of on a more positive note. Carlin had put up that slide with the domino model, and you know, and thinking about, you know, obviously these early life experiences are so important and influence, you know, developmental trajectories, but it's not. You know, it's not the only thing that influences developmental trajectories. And I think Frances showed, you know, some of her work in terms of, you know, changing the environmental context in adolescence. And there's plenty of, you know, also evidence from, you know, child maltreatment and other studies showing that there are lots of ongoing opportunities to intervene, and they can be at multiple levels. So they could be at the schools, they could be at the community level, it could be in the home, and that there's not a cutoff or a certain time where it's too late. And so I think that there's multiple ways that we could intervene that all could contribute to child flourishing.
One of the protective factors is an adult, a caring adult. It can be in the family or outside the family. So any one of us could be that one caring person that gives that hand of support that keeps the child from risky behavior.
Well, I was just thinking, I think it was on NPR just yesterday, and I didn't want to hear it, so I turned it off because I knew what it was going to be, but I just have to say it. And it was, the little byline was, Romney's going to do away with Big Bird. And I'm just being reminded of how political these things are. I'm laughing at that, but you know, that's intruding into programs like Head Start. American citizens, I guess, first need to be educated about what some of these things really mean, because they're serious. And if we believe in children, we can't, you know, elect candidates that are just, you know, eradicating funds that are going to help them, you know? And so, I mean, there you are again with the political issue that gets very, very complex. But maybe we just need to give voice to those kinds of things, regardless of who the candidate is or the party, you know?
Well, we've got a social system, so that does help. So, you know, I mean, we've got our problems as well, but, you know, we've got social medicine. Mothers get paid for maternity leave for a year. So, you know, they get unemployment insurance. And so I think all these things help, right?
Rate of breastfeeding?
I don't know. I don't know our rates of breastfeeding versus the US rates. I have no idea. But I think a key to all this is a good social system, right? I mean, if we look at some of the Northern European countries like Sweden, Norway, right? Australia, yeah. And I know, for example, in Germany, if you're in a daycare, they keep the child with the same daycare worker for the first 4 years. So they don't have this constant shuffle like, we do have in Canada, for example.
I, through the Baby Carrier Industry Alliance, I'm a founding board member from a few years ago when the CPSC decided to take a stand against using baby carriers at all and wanted to sort of regulate them out of practice. And through the Canadian health agencies, who have worked for years with people who work with the indigenous populations there to sort of improve public outcomes, to lower the levels of incest. They really were advocates for saying, you really need to wear your children, and they partnered with us as an agency, their agency with our organization, to promote widespread public announcements about the importance of carrying your child. And we are using that exact program to go back to our politicians and say, can you do this with us? Can you work, CPSC, all 5 commissioners, which are, they're appointed, they're not elected commissioners. So you have two Republicans and 3 Democrats, and then they have staff that are government here. Can we please get you guys on board? And it's through Canada's work with organizations that is actually allowing us to even have a doorway. So in a lot of ways, what Canada is doing is a really great model for us in the United States, which we could talk about more tomorrow, I guess.
I think it's time for us to stop unless there's one last comment from anyone. This is to be continued, right? We sort of got into a lot of applied stuff, which is fine. That's where we need to go. But we'll do more of that tomorrow. There's a list of kind of general questions that Lillian has put together. I have copies if you want to see that. If you're on the panel tomorrow, everybody here is invited to be on the panel. And we have our community members as well. Any last questions? The dinner for the speakers, let's meet at the hotel 10 to 7. We'll walk over, so you have to wear something warm. All right, thank you very much, everyone.